Hello, my name is Elina Lex. I'm a researcher and media practitioner completing a PhD in communication studies at Concordia University, where the project and research I'll be presenting today has emerged. So today I'll be presenting on the research creation project titled Tantramar 2100, and it's a research creation project exploring heritage placemaking and environmental transformation in the Tantramar Marshes, which is one of North America's largest remaining salt marsh ecosystems. Located in a region called the Chignecto Isthmus, derived from the word Chignect, meaning Great Marsh District, or drainage place in Mi'kmaq, the area makes up a narrow 21-kilometer strip of land, separating the waters of the Bay of Fundy from those of the Northumberland Strait, and is the sole terrestrial land connection that joins mainland Nova Scotia to the rest of North America. Situated just above sea level, the landscape is extremely flat and low-lying, sitting on the edge of the world's largest tides from the Bay of Fundy. When I first visited in the summer of 2023, I quickly came to notice that to reach the marshes and protected areas involved almost a daily drive across the Trans-Canada Highway, a major transportation corridor that cuts across the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia border. Traveling back and forth along this highway, the narrow strip of seemingly barren flatlands on either side doesn't exactly scream scenic lookout, with its ecological and historical significance not always immediately obvious. The Tantramar Marshes, like many other wetlands across Canada, have been perceived as empty wastelands, justifying their colonization and reclamation for other productive uses. The marshes are indicative of such spatial and temporal crossroads of European colonization of indigenous lands, which has included the 300-year settler history of draining, ditching, and diking. Now in what is largely a fragmented landscape, there are relatively few areas in the Chignecto Isthmus of intact habitat. By exploring wetlands and heritage in relation to one another, I was interested in exploring what this can reveal in terms of productive convergences. Specifically, I was interested in how these conceptions of history or heritage might shape our understanding of the wetlands, and conversely, how might the wetlands reconfigure our sense or understanding of heritage? When wetlands are put into conversation and are considered heritage, questions related to power, knowledge, value, and the future come to the surface. In wetlands, it's possible to observe heritage as a future-making practice where multiple world perspectives encounter and potentially conflict. Wetlands are places where diverse interests and forms of knowledge converge. The Tantramar Marshes invite such questions as they are both a repository of unique ecological subjects and histories, and a site where climate change is now drawing further attention to the precarious future. A network of dikes first built by Acadian settlers hundreds of years ago along the coastline are currently protecting transportation infrastructure, natural resources, historical features, and coastal communities. Recent trends have shown that an extreme weather or rising sea level caused by climate change could flood the Chignecto Isthmus by the year 2100. Those who are responsible for steering its preservation into the future must continuously accommodate and navigate ambiguity, instability, and emergent processes. But heritage is often thought of in opposition to such things. Landscape heritage is often envisioned as a reference to what has lasting value. This has been a central dynamic to the project, as the wider recognition of inevitable change has led to new theoretical and methodological approaches within domains of heritage, museums, and archives, where heritage practices can be understood as a socially embedded, relational, and more future-oriented process, rather than merely the preservation or representation of a determined fixed past. Taking the place of the Tantramar Marshes and its challenges and uncertainties at its core during this transformative period, Tantramar 2100 is a virtual reality research creation project that explores how immersive storytelling might contribute to the preservation, dissemination, and activation of diverse forms of heritage that make up this endangered and ever-changing landscape. The project was guided by these main questions and motivations. What new forms of heritage understandings, sensory, ecological, speculative, polyvocal, emerge through immersive research creation in this context that may challenge dominant or conventional heritage narratives? How can VR as an experiential medium be used to attend to the marsh's life and the many ways of narrating and relating to the marsh? How might VR allow new kinds of access points and engagement, offering entry points for understanding the landscape's past and its contemporary significance during this transformative period? Methods for the project involved a range of archival, ethnographic, participatory, historical, place-based methods that contributed to the learning with place. The research of this project unfolded over several iterative phases, beginning with 2 periods of extended fieldwork. The first one being in summer 2023, and the second in the winter and spring of 2025. During the initial fieldwork on the Tantramar Marshes, I was lucky to be able to conduct research from a camper van, which was an experience that offered a distinct perspective as the boundaries between research and everyday life began to blur. I was interested by critical walking methods, specifically inspired by Stephanie Springay and Sarah E. Truman's research creation walking methods. As they discuss, walking practices can be bodily, experimental, and consider research or knowledge making as a speculative event emerging from a practice rather than performed or predetermined. They write further that critical walking methods can attune us to the specificities of a place and the ways that place is implicated in ongoing global crises. Critical walking methods embrace embodied means to engage with, understand, and unsettle place histories. Walks were informed by historical and ecological research and focused on the discovery and interplay between material heritage, rural ecologies, and human and non-human dimensions that characterize the environmental configuration of the present-day landscape. Emerging from my fieldwork, the term ruderal became a central framework for describing such impacted landscapes. Ruderal is an ecological term used to describe opportunistic plant species that are adapted and take root in disturbed environments. And it's often used to describe weeds or invasive species. And these are sort of ecologies that emerge unexpectedly by chance. I used walking methods in interviews with local knowledge holders to examine how the landscape hold traces of its history through overlapping timelines, human and non-human interactions, plant life in disturbed areas, and the lasting impacts of colonial land use. Beyond these original categories, Caitlin DeSilve expands this into a term she calls ruderal heritage, which to me became useful for describing evolving approaches to heritage preservation within conditions of ecological crises. Ruderal heritage shifts attention towards underrepresented, overlooked, and non-memorialized aspects in a landscape, as well as histories that are not typically well served by conventional preservation frameworks. In doing so, it also challenges heritage practices that have traditionally prioritized human-centered narratives, cultural artifacts, and the built environment. Building on this framework, I explore how digital creation, including immersive media, virtual world building, and digital storytelling, can function as critical methodologies for engaging with these rural dimensions of heritage. So turning to the VR project itself, the VR takes the user to the location of the tidal 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 River, where through a spatial exploration, they encounter sounds, archival materials, and 3D objects, and stories that recount how this ecologically and historically significant wetland has been shaped, remembered, and imagined over time, and puts histories of land transformation and colonialism into conversation with contemporary perspectives of human and non-human subjects. The virtual environment is 3D modeled and inspired by several key rare plant species on the Chignecto Isthmus, and reflects some of the natural features of the site. Soundscape compositions are composed of a mix of environmental and fauna sounds spatially captured on location during fieldwork in the Chignecto area. The project also features 3D scans using different mobile apps and photogrammetry processes of different sites and subjects that focused on residual and rural forms of heritage. The use of 3D capture technologies for digital preservation and the digital twinning of material and spatial heritage has increasingly been a popular method in digital heritage. High-fidelity imaging techniques like 3D laser scanning, digital photogrammetry, and now Gaussian splatting have quickly captured the attention of the public and professional audiences. Heritage practitioners hope that by integrating 3D capture with immersive virtual and augmented reality platforms, endangered heritage can be captured, materialized, and preserved from the forces that threaten it. With my approach to 3D scanning, I was interested less on creating exact static digital copies through neutral, ocular-centric technical field engagements, but rather exploring how to use them as landscape probes, as creative, sensory, and speculative explorations that could interact with changing material conditions. I was inspired by digital and sensory ethnographic methods, namely by Sarah Pink and Tracy Ireland, where 3D scan meshes were the results of these connections between human and the landscape, as a trace of the sensory and in-place interaction with each field encounter.
It would have been a place for...
Like the living ecologies that govern the site, the VR project enacts a kind of digital living archive presented through a multimodal collection of media, objects, voices, beings that challenge traditional practices of professionalized, expert-based archiving. The blend of heritage material used in the virtual project also contributes to a living archive by recognizing the value of community-sourced, non-expert, and non-human heritage. I'm inspired by other notions of the living archive in which official archives can be remixed and recontextualized in the present tense and in active dialogue, and where new heritage knowledge is potentially created in response to and against an archive's historical facet. In this way, the marsh becomes knowable not just through official records or scientific data, but through the embodied sensory and affective registers that VR enables.
It's the only point that Nova Scotia has with the rest of continental North America. But now, with climate change, it's becoming clear that we can't continue to reside in those areas, or if we do, we have to create all these interventions to be able to do so.
Alongside soundscape recordings, audio interviews were recorded with community stakeholders, including biologists, conservationists, artists, and local naturalists, a range of experts that aren't necessarily within sort of the heritage expert field, but that could contribute a perspective or capture a personal significance of the Tantramar during this transformative time.
The Bay of Fundy tides come in and out twice a day. That's a force to be reckoned with. I've seen the tides come over the railway tracks between Sackville and Olac and leave driftwood on the tracks and on the old Trans-Canada Highway. So I've only seen that once, but I could imagine that could happen very quickly.
As much as this area is growing in population, and so more infrastructure will be required, a different approach is looking at ways that of working with nature and recognizing that, especially in coastal landscapes, that the water is going to shift, it is going to rise. Salt marsh.
Polyphony, which emerged from sound studies, works to decenter a singular authored or dominant worldview, so that multiple perspectives can be created and interpreted simultaneously. Voices were embedded in the virtual reality environment with the intention to create a layered sonic texture of various voices. So I was interested in how this could give the sensation of being able to navigate beyond the official story of place into a web of interconnected sources, where history is not merely transmitted to the viewer, but is presented as an entangled collection of interpretations that can contextualize the landscape. This shifts the idea of history as something that can be displayed as an official narrative to emphasizing many voices, multiple layers of action, and storytelling that particularizes a place. The VR narrative is structured around 3 tidal states, guiding as a temporal framework. The experience begins during low tide and introduces the landscape, encouraging noticing, slowing down, and attuning to what is both visible and concealed. Themes of exposure and hidden life unfold gradually as the marsh reveals itself, not all at once, but in layers. Beneath the surface, histories of land reclamation begin to surface, situating the environment within a longer trajectory of human intervention and transformation. Archival traces, images, film fragments, and sound recordings are reworked and reanimated with the environment. The next scene represents mid-tide and evokes transition, infrastructure, and connection and disconnection. The scene focuses on interactions between infrastructure histories, the several canal building attempts, and infrastructure projects in the area, as well as sea level rise and current climate mitigation, focusing on relationships of human and more than humans at these intersections. Sounds shift and are more spatially layered and present in the landscape. You could hear sounds of migrating birds that intertwine with sounds of industrial activity and construction. Recorded soundscapes throughout the project draw from multiple engagements with the sites, as well as salt marshes that are undergoing restoration, allowing sound to function not simply as an atmosphere, but as a way of registering environmental change and the ongoing processes of transformation within the landscape. The VR experience ends at high tide, where the main focus is immersion and deep listening. The main soundscapes and previous narrative objects that accompanied the 9 main chapters are revisited and refolded back into the landscape and blended with the sounds of the tide to evoke the palimpsest of the past experience. Rather than representing a fixed or recoverable past marsh, the project stages the landscape as fluctuating and unresolved. In summary, the project contributes an ecological and imaginative approach to representing the Tantramar Marshes and its various archives and histories. As I discussed, the marshes' layered history of environmental transformation and degradation offered a particularly compelling site for engaging contemporary questions around heritage, ecology, and representation. In relation to the conference theme, this project approaches research creation as a methodology for engaging with the uncertainty produced by ecological, social, political crises. Change and instability are treated not as obstacles to knowledge, but as the very conditions through which new knowledge can be imagined and negotiated. Within this context, virtual reality functions not only as a representational medium, but as a methodological tool for thinking with the marshes themselves. And I hope to gesture towards sort of this idea of a living and evolving archive that becomes part of an ongoing process of heritage making. Just as the marshes resist static preservation, the VR project also demands flexible and adaptive approaches to future forms and interpretations. This raises broader questions within digital heritage practice and sustainability. Should immersive experiences be presented as stable originals or understood as works that can remain open to transformation, reinterpretation, as part of a larger heritage process itself? VR platforms further complicate these questions by forcing us to consider whether they can meaningfully support sustainable, accessible, and ethically grounded forms of engagement. These remain ongoing questions within my own practice as I continue to explore what future iterations, formats, and modes of participation this project might take into the future. Thank you very much for listening.